This is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another quick deck tech of red-green Scapeshift. A few people have asked me if I intended on playing this deck again. I said I honestly didn't know. This deck's kind of one of those, like, you know, when it's winning it's fine, when it's not winning it's kind of annoying. It's one of the few decks in the format that might be in some ways simpler to play than Burn. So, you know, I don't like to have too many decks that don't involve a whole lot of thinking if it's not doing a whole lot of winning, if that makes any sense. But, you know, red-green Scapeshift is a deck that has been beginning to make a little bit of a comeback. This was one of the original Primeval Titan decks besides Amulet Titan, especially once Valakut the Mountain Pinnacle got unbanned. Basically, this with 6 mountains allows you to start bolting things with land drops. One new card that came into this archetype since it saw a lot of play last was Dryad of the Elysian Grove, which is basically a Prismatic Omen on a creature that allows you to play additional land drops, which means you don't have to play a dead enchantment. Basically, Prismatic Omen said the same thing Dryad does, in that lands you control are every basic land type, which basically turns all your land drops into mountains, which then turns all your lands into turning on Valakut, which allows you to kind of simplify the bolting your opponent process. The key number with this deck is usually 7. Once you have 7 land drops, you can usually Scapeshift, get Valakut and 6 mountains, deal your opponent 18. If you have 8 land drops, you can get 2 Valakuts, 6 mountains, deal your opponent 36 damage. That's kind of usually the multiples. Dryad makes that a little bit simpler. Usually with 6 mana or 6 lands in play, you can Scapeshift with a Dryad in play. Or even go get a Primeval Titan, get 2 Valakuts, and just kind of go nuts from there. So, that is one way of winning with the deck. The other way is, you know, the Dryad plus Primeval Titan, get a bunch of land drops, you know, bolt your opponent, beat them to death, attack, get more mountains, kill them. Toward that end, you have a bunch of ramp. You're playing things like Farseek, Sakura Tribe Elder, Search for Tomorrow. Get a bunch of lands in play. Some number of Colony Heart Expedition, which is a bit of a weird one. It's a really good card on like turn 2 or turn 3. Later in the game, when you've played out most of your land drops, it's kind of an card, but it does allow you to ramp potentially 2 additional lands. One thing when you're playing this deck is noting how many mountains you have left in your deck for Scapeshifts and such. Sometimes you can actually draw or get out too many mountains out of your deck. This deck does play 6 basic mountains, 2 basic forests. Basic Forest is both the best and worst card in your deck. It's specifically good against Blood Moon. It's pretty bad in most other situations. Castle Garenbrig kind of falls into the same category. It's good at casting your Primeval Titans a turn early. It's pretty bad in most other circumstances, especially towards your mountain count, unless you have Dryad in play. Basically what I'm saying is Dryad fixes all evils of this deck. Beyond that, you have a couple copies of Lightning Bolt, a couple copies of Anger of the Gods to interact with your opponent's creatures, because this deck can have sometimes problems with decks going underneath of it with, you know, Monastery Swift Spears, Goblin Guides, etc. Beyond that, you're playing a bunch of mountains, so you're playing things like Cinderglade, 4 copies of Stomping Ground. This particular list running 1 copy of Sheltering Thicket, which is one you can cycle in addition to doing the other stuff. So, basically, it's a very simple deck to understand what's going on. Your ideal hands usually involve 3 or 4 lands, a ramp spell, and a payoff. Sometimes you can get caught in situations where you don't have enough lands to play, and then your Dryads or your other stuff just aren't as powerful. But generally speaking, your ideal hands like 3 or 4 lands, a ramp spell, and a payoff. So, pretty simplistic. Sideboard overall leans heavily towards aggression. Engineered explosives, primarily there for things like Death Shadow and Tarmogoyf. Lightning Bolt and Sudden Shock also combo quite nicely against the Prowess decks. Sudden Shock allows you to kill them without being able to do Prowess triggers because of the split second ability. Lightning Bolt, obviously, premier removal spell in these colors. A couple copies of Veil of Summer for any type of counter spell or discard spell shenanigans. 1 copy of Reclamation Sage and 2 copies of Force of Vigor for any type of Blood Moon effects primarily. Can also be relevant against Leyline Sanctity, but primarily against Blood Moon. Grafdigger's Cage to help against graveyard shenanigans, although generally speaking, you're okay against things like Dredge simply because, you know, you can interact with them once and then generally your combo's fast enough to kill them. 3 copies of Obstinate Baloth for any style of aggressive deck, primarily burn, and then 2 copies of Tireless Tracker for the grindy matchups to give you an additional threat when you're boarding out your Lightning Bolts and Anger of the Gods against something like Blue-Eye Control or Jund or any of that nonsense. Obstinate Baloth is also particularly good against the Legion of the Veil because they uptick it. You get a free 4/4 with 4 life. But, you know, doesn't necessarily compete particularly well with some of Jund's creatures. It's a good card to be able to play on turn 3, especially if you go turn 1, whatever, turn 2, Farseek, Sakura Tribe Elder, turn 3, Obstinate Baloth against Burn. A little bit tricky. Burn overall, not a very good matchup. I have seen some variants of this deck in the past go with stuff like Lane Line of Sanctity, get an edge in that matchup when Burn's a higher portion of the meta. But, you know, overall, Baloth is probably your best card to be able to dropping on turn 3. It both generally has a body that stabilizes the board and gains them life, which requires them to both have an answer in the form of, like, Path to Exile, which isn't great when, you know, we're trying to ramp personally. You know, we don't mind the extra land, gets us to our payoffs quicker, and also, you know, like something like a Skullcrack to keep us from gaining life. So, nice threat on turn 3 against Burn, but sometimes it's just not enough on its own. So that said, let's get into some matches, shall we? Here for match number 1. Fortunately, we won the die roll, so yes, I'd like to play first. Taking a look at this hand overall, while we don't have a payoff just yet, actually no, we actually have basically the perfect hand here other than having Search for Tomorrow. Get to go Sheltering Thicket on 1, Farseek on 2, Dryad on 3, and be set up for a rather quick Scapeshift potentially. A lot of it depends on what our opponent's on. Opponent goes turn 1 Tron land and Expedition map. So things are a little bit tricky. Fetching a Sinner Glade because it's one of those lands that could potentially hinder our development. We just play Dryad, play another land. Opponent plays Karn, or plays All His Dust to kill the Dryad. We play another Dryad. Now we play Search for Tomorrow. Then we play Dryad. This sets us up for Scapeshift if they don't have an answer. Opponent goes Karn Liberated. It's a Wormcoil Engine, exiles that. Plays Relic, which isn't particularly relevant. And then we just have more than enough land. We have 7 lands. They're at 17 because of the Lightning Bolt. We get enough lands and we dome them. So this matchup's just a pure and simple race. Their only interaction in the matchup, at least game number 1, is stuff like Karn or Ulamog. Like a lot of their other payoffs, Wormcoil Engine kind of matters, but kind of doesn't. Let's see, what else? Drag Tusk, once again, kind of matters, kind of doesn't. 4-mana Karn, if they have a Witchbane Orb in their sideboard or something, can be a little bit awkward. Liquid Metal Coating can be a little bit awkward. Like, a lot of their stuff's annoying, but only really 7-mana Karn and Ulamog are the relevant interactions, so to speak. Everything else is kind of but it's very much a race because if they can, you know, start chipping away at our lands, you know, like on turn 3, and we only have like 3 or 4 lands in play, then they could potentially, you know, get an Ulamog with a Sanctum of Ugin, exile 2 more lands, and all of a sudden we don't have enough lands to operate. You know, we are a finite resource deck, even though our deck is pretty simplistic with what it's trying to execute. It does require enough resources to do things. So, anyways, on to game number 2. In some ways, the sideboarding with this deck's a little bit awkward, especially if you're against aggressive decks. I'm still not quite sure like what cards are okay to shuffle in and out in some spots. As far as a deck like Tron, pretty simplistic. Your bolts and your angers come out. You bring in some amount of artifact and enchantment hate, and then you bring in some other payoff. This particular go-round, I brought in the 2 Force of Vigors, the 1 copy of Rex Sage, and one of the Tireless Trackers, just as another threat, you know, because sometimes you don't top deck enough threats. You know, they have O-Stones and stuff to answer things sometimes. This hand is a little bit awkward in terms of lack of lands, but with the 2 ramp spells, this should be decent enough to get there. Our opponent mulliganed to... No, we mulliganed that hand. Interesting. I guess I felt I didn't have enough lands. Really can't speed up our thing too much. This hand's pretty nice. 2 copies of Search for Tomorrow, a Rex Sage, a Primeval Titan. So I think we keep this hand, getting rid of the Rex Sage. Because really on turn 1, Rex Sage is good. Force of Vigor is pretty decent here. Spend the Search for Tomorrow. We go ahead and get rid of their things. They potentially don't have Tron on 3. They get a Karn the Great Creator, which is an interesting one. Obviously dangerous to get rid of a land resource. They have another expedition map, so they're going to have Tron on 4. You know, we do the thing, play the Dryad. That does the thing. Play out our land. So if we top deck something, we could play Titan here. Play Relic, which is whatever. It's completely irrelevant in this matchup. We go ahead and grab Titan. Grab a Valakut and a Mountain to shoot their... Or just grab 2 mountains here to shoot their Karn, deal them 3 damage. Obviously this is a little bit dangerous, but you know, there's not too many things our opponent can have that can both answer Valakut and answer Primeval Titan. It has a Karn. They grab an Ensnaring Bridge, which is actually kind of annoying, but we draw Force of Vigor to get rid of Relic and that. We attack. Get Valakut. And that. Kill their Karn. Once again, this sets us up for basically every land we draw to be a double bolt, and our opponent scoops. So, this matchup is very much about racing. Us being on the play game 1 helps. Us tagging their map in game 2 helped. You know, top decking that Force of Vigor was quite nice in some spots. So, once again, I talk a lot about times about sometimes Magic, you know, one way or the other is important, you know, to understand that there are some plays you can control, some plays it's about luck. This one was a little bit about luck. This one was also, you know, that one first hand we looked at might have been a little too slow in this game, so maybe it was the correct decision to mulligan into that slightly more aggressive hand. And also happening to find an answer to the first expedition map helped a lot, as well as an answer to Ensnaring Bridge. But you know, once again, this matchup's a pure race. I've played some Titan Shift in the past, never been particularly thrilled by it. I mean, this was a couple years ago, but you know, the deck feels okay in the current meta, not great, but okay. So, anyway, let's get on to some other matches. All right, we're back for match number 2. Once again, we're on the play. Take a look at this opening hand. Too many payoffs, not enough ramp. This hand's a mulligan. Unfortunately, I keep this hand, and yeah. Definitely should have mulliganed this hand. Mana's awkward. We don't have any real true ways to draw ramp. Go ahead and kill the Scourge, play the Colony Heart. Plays Death Shadow. We do that. In other words, if we had a fetch land here, we're in some business. Opponent plays Tarmogoyf. So it looks like we're up against Jund Death Shadow here. Scapeshift. I cast Scapeshift here primarily to hit more land drops for our Colony Heart expedition. Might seem weird, but this does set us up potentially to kill our opponent next turn. Unfortunately, I don't think we get it next turn. So, opponent team battle rages us, kills us on turn 5. Once again, taking a look at that opening hand, that was way too many payoffs, not enough ramp and lands. So that is one thing you need to be cognizant of when you're playing this deck, is you need to be a little bit better with managing your mulligan decisions than I was in this particular game. So anyways, let's go on to the next game. I feel like sideboarding when this matchup's a little bit tricky. I ended up boarding out the Lightning Bolts in the Anger of the Gods, because the only creature it particularly kills is Monastery Swizzle Spear. I brought in the copies of Obstinate Baloth, and I bring in, just Obstinate Baloths, and what was the other card I brought in? Engineer Explosives, it looks like, which are cards that can answer them quite efficiently. The downside of this is I forgot to bring in Force of Vigor, Veil of Summer, which could be relevant against their discard spells. This is one of those matchups where I was talking about where it's kind of a little bit awkward to know what's correct to sideboard, what's incorrect. That'd be something, probably have to play the deck a little bit more. Decks like this, you know, and to a certain extent like Burn, you know, they reward you. The base level of knowing how to play the deck is very simple, but like the side effects of, like, you know, what cards do I draw sideboard in, what cards do I sideboard out, etc. You know, that comes with a little bit more experience. The only thing this hand's missing is a payoff, but overall I think it's fine. If we find a Valakut, a Primeval Titan, any of those things, this hand pays off quite nicely. We don't have much interaction, but then again, most of our interaction's pretty bad overall in this style of matchup. That tends to indicate to me, obviously, they have an answer for Dryad in some form or other, or just legitimately don't care about it. They have Dismember here, potentially turns on Death Shadow. We cast Search for Tomorrow. So we're set up, we just kind of need to find a payoff. Opponent just bolts themselves there. We play Colony Heart Expedition, doing the thing. They bolt themselves, attack us for some damage here. Once again, within the deck. And then we just die to Temur Battle Rage. So, one of the downsides of the deck is you do need to hit one of your payoffs. You know, we were set up to, you know, if we would have hit a Valakut, they were dead, because we would have been able to play Valakut, sack Colony Heart Expedition there, or we could have at least killed the Death Shadow. That's one of the things about this deck is it is a combo deck. You know, you do need your combination of lands and payoffs. That's one of the tricky parts with red-green Scapeshift as well. The deck is remarkably consistent. There are some holes in it. You know, Valakut obviously is a payoff in this spot. Scapeshift's a payoff. Primeval Titan's a payoff. You could have argued maybe we're supposed to crack this Colony Heart Expedition, but then, you know, that gets 2 mountains out of our deck. But then it reduces our outs by 4, so, you know, whether this was the correct play or not, you know, we just died to our opponent having a reasonable but not terribly exciting draw. They were able to answer our only copy of Dryad, and even without a Valakut, the Dryad was kind of whatever. So, you know, they just double bolted themselves, played a quick Death Shadow, and killed us with a Temur Battle Rage. So, anyways, on to the next match. We're back for the third match in this video, and third match overall in this league. We're going to play this game, which obviously is nice. Taking a look at this hand. Obviously, this hand's quite nice. 4 lands, 2 ramp spells, a payoff. Go ahead and lead on this. It leads on a Flooded Strand. We try to play Colony Heart Expedition. They have Spell Snare, which is a bit unfortunate, but it looks like we're up against some type of potentially Blue Moon or something. Maybe Jeskai. Kind of hard to say here. Control decks have seemed like a pretty reasonable matchup overall. They failed to close out the game fairly quickly. Beyond that, you know, this is kind of a crazy spot here because it allows us to play the Valakut, crack, kill their Jace. So one of the things about these blue-white X control decks is sometimes they struggle with a deck like ours. And we get the Valakut, kill them, we play Prime Time. They're probably relying on Force of Negation here to protect them from Scapeshift. And, you know, we do have 2 different types of payoffs. We have the creature payoffs, we have the spell payoffs, you know, Scapeshift obviously being the insta-kill in most spots. But Primeval Titan, you know, plus Dryad. One thing with the blue-red variants of control is they're not particularly good at killing X4s or larger. You know, Dryad obviously a little bit harder to kill. You know, sometimes they have things like Roast or Magmatic Explosion, you know, those kind of things. But they do have the advantage of being able to play something like Blood Moon, which will certainly be a card we'll have to be considerate of in the post-board games. But, you know, getting game number 1 against control is always nice. And on to game number 2 and sideboarding. Sideboarding, once again, a little bit awkward. I keep forgetting to bring in Veil of Summers, which is kind of embarrassing against these counterspell decks. But with a Blood Moons on the horizon, I ended up bringing in the 2 copies of Force of Vigor, the 1 copy of Rex Sage, and then the 2 copies of Tireless Tracker, board out 1 Summoner's Pact, which may or may not be correct, but once again, you're staring down Blood Moon. You don't always want to be fetching basic forests. The sand seems pretty reasonable. A little bit vulnerable to Blood Moon. Double Valakut, not the most ideal, but we only need 1 green source really to operate here. Opponent does the thing. We play that because they can't Blood Moon us on 1 anyway. Roger and Tron gave me a little bit of pause. Maybe they have some sideboard cards. Maybe they were just Jeskai, and we missed out on it. They play Blood Moon here, so we're going to have to win with creatures primarily, or hope to find one of our other payoffs. I just play the Valakut. Once again, doesn't particularly matter. Swing with that. I guess I could have tried to jam Primetime here, but I feel like there's an Ether Gust or something sitting there. Opponent just does the thing. They start beating us down, and then we kind of get into this long, protracted back and forth where we try to resolve that. They Ether Gust us. We put it on top. They opt. We do the thing. We continue to attack them. It's possible that I was just supposed to try to resolve Dryad, which is much more likely to resolve in some of these spots. But just continue to attack, thin our deck a little bit. Well, it kind of sucks, obviously, if they find a payoff, or not a payoff. It sucks to thin our deck if we find one of our ways to break out of this Blood Moon, but the odds of it resolving seem pretty low. While we are, quote-unquote, winning the race, our opponent does have Lightning Bolts in their deck, so they're likely to be able to close the game a little bit faster than we are in this 2-for-2 trade. I could sit back, but once again, I don't think that kind of stuff favors us. You know, they do stuff here, and they play another Snapcaster Mage. And at that point, we concede because there's basically nothing we can do to break out of this. They have a bunch of cards in hand, and you know, we're not winning 6 damage to 2 when the life totals are this close. So Blood Moon got us a little bit there. Not that I was surprised that they brought it in, but you know, really there's only so much you can do to play around it whenever you're playing this kind of deck. So anyways, on to game number 3. Once again, taking a look at sideboarding, feeling really embarrassing leaving Veils of Summer in my sideboard. But once again, we're trying to play around Blood Moon first and foremost. Feels like the only card that kind of matters. This hand is kind of nice. You know, we have 2 payoffs. No real ramp, but we do have a Dryad, so if we hit additional land drops, it's fine. But the Force of Vigor kind of indicates that we want to keep this kind of hand anyway. Opponent does the thing. We draw one of our 2-mana ramp spells. Opponent opts. Fortunately, they can't counter this one with a Spell Snare. I go ahead and grab a land. This allows us to play... what did I do there? Oh, I suspended Search for Tomorrow, but didn't cast Dryad because there's no value to be gained from it. Kind of hoping that our opponent plays a Blood Moon here, but they don't, unfortunately. We draw a bunch of payoffs, which is kind of whatever. They mana leak this. Once again, not great. We cast Search for Tomorrow. They allow it to resolve. We hard cast another Search for Tomorrow. They allow it to resolve. Fortunately for our opponent, they don't think they realize that we have like a bajillion payoffs in our hand. Opponent probably representing we play Primeval Titan, they Snapcaster Mage, Ether Gust the darn thing, no mana leak, sorry. They do the thing. The funny part is we're only 1 land away from double Scapeshifting. Our opponent goes for Blood Moon there. Is for that. We try to do this. They looked like they had some way to answer it, but then they just let us do the thing. We play Dryad here. They Ether Gust it. Put Dryad on the top of our deck. That does the thing here. They only have 2 cards in hand, so play Dryad. They Ether Gust it. And then we cast Scapeshift, hoping it'll resolve. It does. And then we do the thing, and everything goes at our opponent's face, and we win the game. So, you know, if our opponent's last card would have been another counterspell, we could have been in a little bit of trouble there. It's possible that I wasn't supposed to force a vigor at the end of their turn. Still think we needed to break out of the Blood Moon there, so, you know, I think our opponent's actually supposed to try everything they can to counter that spell. I think that that's one of those things that, you know, the Blood Moon is kind of their ticket to winning the game. You know, without Blood Moon, I feel we're favored to win the game overall. But, you know, sometimes you gotta get a little bit lucky to win some matches. And with that, we're going to wrap up the video with a quick wrap-up of the deck so far. So far we've played a league and a half. Actually, I've played 2 leagues so far as I finish up the league that we're pre-recording here. But my general overall thought of the thing through 8 or 10 matches, however, you know, I'd be looking at this, is it feels pretty good against the control decks. You know, overall, even the ones with Blood Moon, we've been pretty successful at beating so far. Feels a little bit weaker to these like Jund or Red-Black Death Shadow decks, just because we're so poorly equipped to, you know, kind of kill their creatures. And, you know, they generally can put on a fast clock plus relevant disruption. You know, the red-black version also can play Blood Moon, which is problematic. You know, that's one of the things with this deck is it is vulnerable to really fast aggro, and especially ones with disruption. Burn tends to be a rough but close matchup. The Death Shadow variants just feel kind of miserable, but I think that can be said for most versions of Primeval Titan decks, is just Death Shadow seems to be their natural kryptonite. But the format overall has slowed down enough to the point where I think this deck is fine. It's not going to be tier 1 or anything, but it's a deck that you can play and not feel terrible about your decision, especially if you want a simple to play deck that isn't burn. Beyond that, I would say, you know, be a little bit more familiar with the mulligan decisions, be more familiar with your like sideboard cards. That's the thing with this deck, is I'm not sure, outside of these like 4 cards and non-aggro matchups, what you're supposed to be boarding and boarding out. Are you supposed to be boarding out like a Scapeshift and, you know, I don't know. That's the thing, is this deck is so much a you know, A plus B equal combo deck that's just like, okay, what can you afford to board out? Can you afford to board out a Scapeshift, a Summoner's Pact? You know, can you afford to board out a Dryad? Can you afford to board out a Primeval Titan? That's the thing, is I don't know, like, especially against non-control decks, like when you're boarding in like Obstinate Baloths and, you know, all this stuff, and you're like, okay, I have these cards I want to bring in against an aggressive deck. What am I boarding out? You know, am I not boarding in Engineer Explosives? You know, that's just like, you know, you can only afford to board in so many cards in some of these like linear combo decks. It's just like, that's one of the tricky parts with this deck that I'm not quite certain of. Don't have enough familiarity with these decks to know, you know, like, am I supposed to be boarding out like a Scapeshift in a prime time, or am I supposed to be boarding out like one of my random like ramp spells, you know, or a land? You know, what am I supposed to be boarding out in these spots? It's just one of those things I'm not quite sure of. If you have a little bit more familiarity with Scapeshift decks, I could certainly appreciate your help. But beyond that, I mean, the deck feels fine. I think we went 3-2 in our first league. Gotta be cognizant of some of your sideboard cards, like, you know, I played 2 matches where Veil of Summer would have been relevant. I didn't board it in a single time. Oops. Beyond that, you know, just a matter of getting the reps down with the deck. I mean, it's not very complicated to play, especially game number 1. But, you know, it is a deck with a fail rate, because you need a payoff, generally speaking. Though generally your lands can be payoffs too. And then beyond that, it's fairly simplistic. Can be a little bit boring to play sometimes, but sometimes you just need a deck that's simple to play, even besides burn. So, if you like a simple to play ramp deck, this is a fairly easy to grind with deck. Whether it's good in the meta or not would probably require more data. But anyways, This has been John for MTG Nexus with the first 3 matches in this league. We'll be back later with another couple matches in this league on replay. As a friendly reminder, if you do like modern content, especially of the red-based variety, please consider subscribing to our channel, as we aim to be the most informative modern channel for MTG on YouTube.